By the way, you might get a prompt saying that you consent to be on the live stream.
Yep.
Okay, I think we're on. Awesome. Anthony, thanks for being on the session today. I'm gonna call these live streams. I try to think about what to call them: podcasts, video chats, whatever. They're live streams. Thank you for joining on. It's a pleasure to have you. Let's see. I think you and I first started talking when I saw you announce, your project Confectionery being open source, and I thought that was exciting. Mainly for two reasons. One is just the willingness to have mind share in the industry. I think it's an interesting topic. Sometimes people hold them as their price secrets, but I think the mind share was really, really great to see, and it was awesome to see someone take on that project like that full time. But anyways, that's how we met, and Anthony, it's a pleasure to have you on. Maybe I think a way to get this going is let's talk a little bit about yourself. If you could do a quick introduction about yourself, your background, and we can go from there.
Sure, sounds great. Thank you for having me. Definitely appreciate the opportunity to chat. As far as my background goes, definitely been in tech for a bit. Kind of early on, I knew I was kind of a math and science guy, but started off in high school doing a few programming courses, and then I started doing like a high school internship doing tech support for my school district. So ripping apart some of the computers and rebuilding labs over the summer and whatnot. So definitely got the chip on my shoulder from the help desk and whatnot, and kind of went down that kind of sysadmin style role. From there, kind of jumped into networking, thinking about going like pure network engineering for a while. But once I had that kind of network engineering and sysadmin experience under my belt, kind of wanted to move more into the applied space, I guess. So look, now that I knew how computers worked and how networks worked, could I secure those systems? So I was able to get a couple internships during college, kind of in that network security space. And right after college, I started to work for Cigna, it kind of in that network security space. It was super timely, and I'm kind of super fortunate for it. But the summer that I started there was kind of after one of those huge healthcare breaches, so there was definitely a lot of interest in the word cybersecurity and trying to build that perimeter up and try to make it as secure as possible. So that kind of got me into that security space. And then after a couple of years of that, we kept seeing this word cloud pop up more and more, and development teams were starting to push out different apps out there, and we were like, hey, we should probably do something about this. So I kind of raised my hand internally and said, hey, can I get involved in this cloud thing around the 2017 timeframe? And kind of the past couple of years have just flown by trying to keep up with everything going on there and help enable teams, but also protect the sensitive data that Cigna is the custodian of it there, as we kind of move our applications out to cloud and help provide for the different customers and clients that we work with.
That's awesome. And I love the transition, mainly because like you see a lot of times when you think about cloud security, you need to have a lot of a background around, like software development is definitely highly recommended, as you always often see. But like on the other hand, you can't get away from some basic concepts around network and compute. And so, could you walk a little bit through like how that transition went? I mean, you raised your hand and said, this cloud security sounds interesting. I want to take it on. But going from network security engineering to effectively cloud security, what was that transformation like? What were some of the things you ran into, and then, some advice?
Yeah. I was kind of like a reluctant software engineer too. So I did take those programming courses in high school, and then I went to RPI for college, and my IT degree there was multidisciplinary, so had a mixed bag of IT courses, management courses, computer science. But I was always like that. I was someone that didn't want to code for 8 hours a day. Just be a software engineer and just code away and kind of toil away at that. So it was always in the background, but it didn't really come to the forefront, I'd say, until I was doing some of the custom integration works of trying to make APIs work together for some of the network security stuff. But and doing that glue work of here's vendor product A and vendor product B, and we need to get them to talk to each other. But as soon as you step into cloud, it's all about that and trying to automate something that for a company the size of Cigna, we quickly realized like it manually going through the AWS console and trying to check off different boxes and disable and delete things is just not scalable. So I really loved my first foray, I think, into it was kind of that experience of a Lambda function of understanding how to use some of the SDKs to automate the different pieces that every time we vend an account internally, we want to standardize some of those configurations. So how can we do little scripts that might, set a password policy or delete certain resources or something like that. And then just chain those together over time to try to have consistent configurations that we're handing out there. So I think that there was stuff like that. It also made kind of auto remediation and reacting to certain events to say, if this event occurs and it meets X, Y, and Z, let's react and do this. So just having the understanding of what could be a risky configuration at the same time as having some kind of scripting background and being able to interact with those services was a good kind of complement to make it easier to start doing that. But then also having to worry about doing it at scale as well.
Yeah, I mean, this was always in the back of my head, right? When you said Lambda functions auto remediation, in my head, are you just gonna just blow up something because it didn't follow the requirements? What is that experience like? Like, do people call you and be like, "What's going on? Why did you do this? Why is this Lambda function doing X, Y, and Z? Explain to me," right? Like, does that happen? And yeah.
Yeah, that was definitely something I realized pretty early on. So I had this internal tool that I developed that would end up just finally sunsetting recently, but it was called Kraken because it was running from a central account, reaching into all the other accounts. So came up with a clever name for that. But we did a couple rules in that, and then we realized like we couldn't silently fix something without letting somebody know. So that's we try to kind of mature the structure around that. I'm a big fan of AWS has a document called the Cloud Adoption Framework, specifically the security perspective, and they kind of break it down into 4 different sections where they have governance control, which is like what is the expectation, detective control, so like can I see if somebody's not following that, preventative control, can I outright stop somebody from introducing that risk, and then there's the auto remediation, which is kind of where the Kraken stuff or cloud custodian that kind of plays in that space as well. So trying to get maturity across all that where we can't do an auto remediation if we haven't even told people the expectation. So I think trying to strike that balance of partner with teams where, hey, we want to consume this AWS service or this Azure service that somebody just pushed out. What are the security controls that are available? What are the operational controls? Does it need to run in multiple availability zones? And get that expectation just down on paper. And then somebody can take a Terraform, CloudFormation, ARM, whatever the relevant IAC tool is, and start codifying those as best practices. We can write a policy as code rules too to start looking for that stuff. And then kind of over time proceed towards preventative controls to make sure that everybody's following it.
In the cloud adoption framework, I've gone through it a bit, and it's an interesting concept because they try to keep it abstract, and it's almost intentional. Like, not everyone can codify their infrastructure. Not everyone can move to using Terraform and or any infrastructure as code, or maybe there's just things that are not worth the effort. We've legitimately heard these things too, right? Like, we had this cloud service, we had this service running in AWS. It was 4 years ago. It still, sets a reminder to people to fill their prescription, and it's just based on a schedule, right? Based on the database. And yeah, I don't want to touch it, do you how does that play into this, right? Because I could definitely tell from the adoption framework, you can see there's a hesitation to say very prescriptive technical controls on how to do it, and it just focuses more around at the higher level, right? How do you deal with sort of, that could happen, or does it happen? Do you still see it happen, and how do you handle that, right?
Yeah, I think there's always a balance to it. So like at the end of the day, like businesses have to make money, so the security team can't be the party of no, right? So you can't just say, oh, you violate one rule, therefore you can't make any forward progress, and you can't bring that product to production. That's not going to work. So I think at the end of the day, a lot of that, taking a framework like that it's about risk visibility. So even if you can't prevent everything, having the visibility with the detective control to say across all my AWS accounts, are there any public S3 buckets? Something like that. So then at least the application owner, the security reviewer, the different stakeholders can have that kind of full picture of security risk or operational risk to say, here's where we currently are. Like I think the dream state, you might have like a security risk score or an operational risk score, but that's hard to compute there. But just at least having a full picture of what is the current state, and then saying, hey, over this next sprint or this quarter, can we make an improvement to the overall security score and understand how much security technical debt or operational technical debt we have, and make informed choices on feature delivery versus some of these just table stakes with security and operational concerns.
Yeah, it's an interesting balance. Like you gotta balance what the business needs, what can be accomplished, can it be done in a certain time frame. These are all, I mean, if you think about it, they're very much concepts around agile methodology that are highly encouraged, right? When you think about what you put in each sprint, or when you do sprint planning. But then at the same time, like bringing that into security strategy is an interesting concept like that. I think it's understated in my opinion. Like it's a balance that you have to play every single time for every service, and the whole essence of it is to just improve the security risk, right, and security posture. So it's interesting. Okay, sorry, I'm gonna move to a different direction. Like I didn't mean to unpack there. Let's talk about your development tool chain. I mean, the whole premise behind this is, let's talk a little bit about how you go about working on your projects. What's part of your tool chain? This could be research resources, what you use as part of your IDE, everything. Feel free to share.
Cool. Yeah. I think overall for like my go-to languages, I'm definitely a fan of Python and Golang. If we need to throw together a quick little command line utility or whatnot, Golang's really good for that. I find Python's approachable for a lot of folks too. So working with some security folks who might not have a strong security or software engineering background, it's easier, I think, to teach somebody Python and kind of learn the ropes, because sometimes like you read through a Python program and it's almost like you're reading, just plain English on a piece of paper kind of thing. So definitely a big fan of those. Specifically for Golang, I'm a big fan of just the built-in tooling. So having a built-in formatter and the test frameworks and all that, of having it helps scale when you're not just the only person on the project, but have to work with others. Having some of that tooling built into the language itself is awesome. As far as like CI tools go, I can take it or leave it with a lot of different ones. I think Actions on GitHub has been super smooth. We added that into Confectionery. Like I put it all together before the first time I pushed it up, and I need to make like one small tweak to make it work. But overall, it's been super easy to work with. But at the end of the day, if you're just running different bash scripts and whatnot, most CI tools can do that. It's just how much parallelization and caching, and I think there's some interesting stuff going on there in the build tool space, but I'm not really partial to any one build tool right now. As far as kind of infrastructure as code, I think Terraform is just super powerful and flexible as far as the providers go. So anything from the major CSPs to some on-prem hybrid cloud stories there, the ability to just kind of programmatically describe that stuff is super flexible. And then I'm also a big conf test fan, if you couldn't tell by Confectionery. Just the ability to do that linting and like the movement towards I think cloud and having environments as code and whatnot, all that configuration as code. I think that keeps being more and more important, of validating all those different parameters. So everybody who works with Kubernetes is probably a YAML engineer, and validating all those different inputs and making sure it's the right structure and whatnot, right? Just building that in and kind of trying to get those feedback loops as short as possible. So building something into a feature branch to get that back to the developer before they deploy it and find out it's broken. Definitely a big fan there. I think the last thing I'll add is probably just I'm a big fan too of like trunk-based development, to keep it as simple as possible. Git is a complex tool. I don't mind jumping in and doing a rebase when I need to, but at the end of the day, trying to keep it simple and trunk based. You do a feature branch off it, make it live for a day or two, get it merged back in, and maybe do a tagged release. I think that's the ideal state for doing stuff. I think there's room for improvement in the IAC space of like how to handle some of that. But if you can do that with like versioned like artifacts for code itself, I think that's a good approach to not make it too complex on your other teams that you're working with.
Oh man, you touched on something we'll unpack later on, because that small comment about how infrastructure as code and Git can work better. I think it's an interesting topic we hear nowadays. I mean, it's a whole new space now, the TACOS, right? So yeah, it's interesting. Okay, great. So, okay, let me just double check. Okay, great. I just wanted to make sure there weren't any comments or questions here. So, let's see. Now, I mean, you started in cloud security in 2017, right? So it's been effectively 4 years. It sounds like you've kind of done quite a lot on the spectrum of what a lot of people look into doing for cloud security strategies, right? You know, CSPM-like capabilities that you just build in-house with auto remediation, and then now you have confectionery. And like, where do you see now kind of the things you're needing to pay attention to? Like, what would you say is something that, I hate the word keeps you up at night, but basically that, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
What's now your focus?
Yeah, I think kind of what you were saying, get the CSPM space, being a larger company too, we are definitely looking at, multiple clouds and whatnot. So trying to keep enough control, but also enable the business. So, hey, I want to go use this niche SaaS service or this major, IC service, but hey, we have no footprint there. What is the minimum amount of governance that we need around that to keep it secure without opening the floodgates of risk too? So if we can use some of the preventative controls, AWS has SCPs, Azure has Azure policy. So like disabling certain services unless it has been gone through that review. And we do have policy as code rules for X, Y, and Z, or detective controls in the CSPM. We try to do that. So I think trying to keep pace with that is definitely the challenge when you also have, hundreds of development teams saying, hey, I want to do this combination of services or this combination of services, which might have, 2 or 3 more than that other team in a slightly different way. So I think the biggest challenge is standardization while also giving development teams enough choice, but also making informed decisions on that. So, that one of the common terms you'll hear is the paved road versus the unpaved road, but making that a reality of kind of actually SaaSifying internal services. So I think probably for smaller companies, it's not as much of a problem if you have a single product maybe, but for an 80,000 person company, trying to make sure that teams can have a simple story around trying to solve a particular problem, if that makes sense. So rather than having to worry about all the complexity of a full CI/CD pipeline and understanding all the networking bits in a major cloud provider, and all the complexities of identity and access management in the cloud, and 15 other governance groups that they have to talk to, can we productize that whole experience to say, hey, you're just doing an ETL job. That's the right. That's the business value that you're trying to do to move something. Why do you have to worry about all this complexity? So I think trying to make a better story around that all those concerns around the security things that they would have to solve for if they took on that complexity, can we get that out of the way and talk about just the vulnerabilities in the code that you're writing for that ETL job, or just the differentiating bits that are actually providing that business value.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. I feel like nowadays the complexity definitely is emphasized in data and ML ops teams or ML teams. They have their preference. They, whether it's Jupyter notebooks or something else, right? But the data resides in GCP and Bigtable, right? Okay, well, right, right away. Then there's a lot of problems, and it's funny, like, each cloud provider, to your point, has just so many nuances that are different. Like, GCP has all the APIs disabled by default, right? So, okay, that's a little bit easier to think about hardening, access, and control. AWS, That's an interesting one. Of course, people might agree and disagree here, but that's just generally my opinion about this, because of what you just said, right? Standardization is so hard as a topic. Each provider just is different. They're different animals, different beasts. And unfortunately, as much as people say, well, compute is compute, storage is storage, network is networking, they all behave differently still. Yeah, it's an interesting problem. Like, how do you go about solving that, right? Like, so is Terraform sort of the strategy around paved versus unpaved road here? How does that work?
Yeah, I think there's some stories there that help with, like, Terraform definitely speeds up adoption of standardization. I don't think it's the end state. So you might use Terraform to spin up a database, but you might still be irresponsible with like how much privileges you're giving to a user on that spun up database. So it's nice to build that basis, and it does abstract away some of it. But I think if you can leverage something like Terraform to think in a multi-tenant way too. So if you do look at the cloud providers, right? If we look at Amazon, if we look at Microsoft, the way that they consume those services is the same way that we do too. So if you can get that kind of multi-tenant mindset too, of that every interaction, it does have a contract and an API, that, you know, that's kind of, I feel like, where larger companies are heading towards, of trying to add those guardrails around those APIs to say this is the way that you can consume the service. You can't even change the underlying operating system because that's not even an option when you consume the specific service that's solving the specific problem. So I think that just finding those teams that want to build those platforms and those kind of productized experiences, I think is a good way to go about it. And partnering with them to build all those guardrails in at the same time. So if it is a conf test every time somebody puts in a merge request for a new tenant on that thing, or it's when they're hitting the API, you're validating all those fields in a certain way. And then you still have that underlying, you know, CSPM style. Is everything being deployed by that platform consistent? Yes. But if it's using Terraform under the behind the scenes to stand all that up consistently, then now you make one change with that platform team, and you benefit, like, the 50 teams that are consuming that, you get all that solved for you rather than having to go talk to 50 teams individually. So trying to find those partnerships where we can, to help speed adoption of that.
It's an interesting concept because, and I kind of want to talk a little bit about that. I mean, it sounds like Kraken's not really dead. It sounds like it's evolved a bit. But you know, the whole idea of doing security at scale is an interesting problem, I think, primarily in the cloud providers versus, you know, if you think about data centers and on-prem, like, you know, the controls around security requirements on data center, they're well-defined, well-formulated, and you know, the architecture doesn't really change that crazily, right? But everything in the cloud is ephemeral. You know, you can't even judge things by their AWS accounts. So it's an interesting problem, because then what is the linchpin behind all of this, right? And it really starts with a codification or building process. But obviously, like you're pointing out, like you have multiple streams happening at the same time. This person in the platform team defines the golden template for an RDS database, right? This other team is building the golden template around, you know, private and a public network architecture, right? And what are the controls? What are the things you block or not allow? And so, you know, when you interlace all those things together, sometimes it becomes an interesting challenge, right? You know, so it's interesting. Okay.
Yeah. Just one thing to add there too. I think if you pick that wrong line of abstraction, then it can become more complex too. So if you do have to consume 15 different modules to get one thing done, then, you know, that you've went ahead and made it more complex on the developer, rather than having a simple one-line API that they can say, I just want a dev environment or a Jupyter notebook to do some, you know, data analysis on something, right?
Yeah, it's an interesting problem, because then at one point is, do you start, the term here is going to be divorce, but basically fork your Terraform into separate files, and they're basically each their own, right? At what point do you start making those decisions? So it's an interesting concept. And then version control, dealing with Git, it's all different fun stuff. But okay, so standardization is an interesting topic. When you talk about standardization, do you reference more of like, you want to put together an ETL job, you want to use AWS and GCP. Here are the services. Here's how they need to be deployed. Here's what they can access and not access. And, this is it. Or you want to go the unpaved route, figure it out on your own, but you're gonna have to come to us. We'll have to understand the security requirements. What are the controls we might need to put in place? It's not cookie cutter, so it might take more time. Is that kind of the premise here and the workflow?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, I think we don't want 15 different approaches to the same solution, but if you can tolerate 2 to 5 maybe, then over time. But it's also just that alignment on what are the expectations. So Cigna's obviously in a highly regulated industry, so HIPAA comes into play, and I'm sure banks have similar stories there. So like there is certain regulatory requirements that you're expected to follow. So the complexities of that and just making that complexity visible to development teams, like kind of like you were saying, if you do want to go that unpaved road, more than happy to support you. But I think the more similar capabilities that we see across different teams that we can enable with a standardized approach, then we have more time to work with those teams on those emerging services to really dive in and kind of figure out what is the security concerns that we need to address with this new service, or do we need to build a new Terraform module to address those, or a new policy as code rule, or anything like that.
Just curious. So I don't know if you know this, but I think it was Air Force One. I forget who, but they basically provided pre-canned Terraform templates for AWS and Azure services that are quote unquote FedRAMP certified Terraform. Would you guys ever do something like that?
Yeah, it's definitely interesting. I think the devil's in the details too on like some of the Terraform modules. So like I was saying, if you end up consuming how you consume those 15 different modules, and the interpinnings between those modules can kind of introduce some security risk itself too. So I think that's the careful. You got to be a little careful there.
But those are the details. I totally get it. I mean, the interdependencies of the resources are actually something we think about a lot. I mean, actually, that's like 80% of our time. But it's just so interesting. I mean, going through a lot of these certifications, like there's a network I was talking to. It's a startup and in healthcare, but it take them like, because they're introducing security strategies, a little bit later, past Series A, they're trying to like accelerate all of these concepts as fast as possible. And it's like, how do you not burn, obviously, the developer experience as well as burn the business in doing so, right? And a lot of times it's just like we just didn't have resources available. Like there wasn't a predefined template around an RDS instance and how it could be quote unquote, right, HIPAA compliant or high trust, right? High trust is even worse. So it's interesting.
Yeah, I think with that too, just like trying to get that feedback loop as short as possible, because it's the worst when something's already out there and then you have to go figure out who owns this, and they missed the the owner tag or whatever. So that was a lot of the driver for Confectionery, to just try to like have it be a 20-second feedback loop, rather than, hey, you've already deployed it, hey, it's in prod, and we found it during a scan of our perimeter or whatever. Like that's the worst state, and then have to track it all the way back through vulnerability management and whatnot. But if you can just say, hey, before you even ever introduced it into the environment, we can let you know you missed a tag on your S3 bucket, then that's a huge win.
Yeah, and sorry, I just wanted to add to that. I mean, it's interesting because like the productivity is such a big deal. I mean, the feedback loop is such a big deal, and I do think people kind of state it, but like calculating the ROI is also another thing too. Like there are productivity gains, and what are those? And I mean, it helps build champion, like it helps champion your strategies, what you want to implement as a security team, right? So
yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Okay, awesome. So this is great. Now, if you think about like what you're now trying to tackle on, do you have any advice for newcomers in cloud security? I mean, it's so different from 4 years ago. I hate to say it, but it's true, right? Like where to start, what to focus on, what's the 0 to 60, or I'm sorry, what would be the 0 to 30 day kind of trajectory?
Yeah. When I first jumped in, I definitely went down the certification path. I thought that was valuable just to get, again, kind of what I was mentioning with the sysadmin and the networking experience, understanding how it works so then you can secure it. So I did go through some of the like formal AWS certifications for the sysops and whatnot. So that was helpful just to get the lay of the land. Even if you just do like a cloud practitioner, just get a general 10,000 foot view of how these services might abstract away concepts you're familiar with from the on-premise days. I think is super helpful. From there, like I think you just have to accept that you're not going to be a SME in everything in cloud. There's just too much there. So like know which battles you want to pick and choose to fight. So kind of building a network across your company is definitely helpful. So I know folks that are very comfortable with the kind of data and analytics services within AWS. So I might go to them if I have a question on, hey, how would this interact with this other service or something like that. And just kind of going back and forth of you might be able to teach them something and vice versa. So that's definitely super helpful there. There's a lot of content out there for sure. And I think a lot of the cloud providers have some free trial stuff. So as long as you stay within the boundaries of that free trial, you won't get charged anything, but just be careful if you're spinning up a 4x large database or something. But that being said, like it is pretty easy to spin up a EC2 instance or an S3 bucket or something over in Azure, and just try it out. And they'll have full tutorials. You download the Git repo, run through the Terraform or whatever. HashiCorp's like documentation around their whole learning experience is pretty good too. So trying out Terraform with AWS or one of the other major cloud providers has a pretty good story there too. I think it is a complex space, so you just have to kind of be willing to understand that it'll take time. When I first started, I always confused what CloudWatch and CloudTrail were just because the names were too similar. But now I know it like the back of my hand, and I can generally tell you what most AWS services can do. But I'm still not a SME in every major cloud provider, and I rely on other folks within my team and whatnot to keep me honest there. If I'm like, hey, is it like this, but except not that, and they'll correct me if I'm wrong or whatever. But it's an exciting space, and I think just trying to jump in and kind of be a sponge and learn as much as you can is definitely a good approach. But at the same time, it can be a lot.
Yeah, I don't think there's ever a dumb question in the cloud. Like, I mean, when I first started getting my certification and then I started understanding security groups, and I was like, wait, so I get how security groups work. What services use security groups? And that question stumped me. I looked online, it stumped me, and I'm like, okay, how do I tackle that question then? And I think curiosity is definitely a big play here, and just willingness to realize like you don't have all the answers, and maybe sometimes other people don't too, and you just need to dig into it and research it together, right? I think that's very fundamental. It's like fundamentally the right approach with cloud security, I think. That being said, now that you're kind of I mean, you call yourself a SME, just to say it out there. But now that you're a SME, like, what is your framework around tackling a problem, like tackling an issue you want to solve? What are the things you think about? Do you factor in stakeholders? How do you go about introducing something you want to implement to the rest of the team? Do you mind sharing a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. I think to your point, like with stakeholders, and kind of going back to our previous conversation around like the Kraken stuff and not notifying people, you kind of have to figure out like what's palatable too. So I think figuring out where you can partner with the right groups if you make it easy to contribute to and kind of like leverage that whole, community as an accelerator. So if you make it easy enough to like contribute an internal policy as code rule, could that engineer that's just passionate about security but might not even be in the formal security org contribute something back and say, hey, I'm working with you guys on emerging service X on AWS just announced this yesterday, and I'm really jazzed to go like build this, and that working with them to even get external internal contributions from outside your team kind of thing. So I think that's definitely a piece of it. At the end of the day, if I might have opinions on what I would consider secure for a certain solution, but it's if I can't get everything on my wish list, it's at least making sure that that person understands the risk of not doing it. So on any given day, I would rather have full, risk visibility rather than a preventative control that pisses somebody off, because then they're just not going to be not going to like you and not going to want to work with you in the future. So if you block something that every developer across the company needs, they're probably going to be knocking on your door and talking to your boss and whatnot. So I'd rather have that risk visibility rather than kind of making an enemy out of somebody that I want to collaborate with.
Yeah. Community as an accelerator. That's actually a really great term. I've never heard of it this way, but I mean, it's two ways, right? Like on the one hand, if you enable something as a service, basically a security as a service, that also helps them in their long terms. Like, they can probably try to contribute in some way. Maybe they'll create their own policy as code because they've thought through some limitations or some security risks, right? It's always awesome to see, at least for me, is to see an engineer with a security mindset, because I mean, they don't need to. They really don't. I mean, it's great. It's awesome if you can, but they don't need to, right? And having sort of a medium to do that, doing policy as code is a great example of that. Is, I think, really helps accelerate the community effect of contributing both within the security team or outside of it, right? Yeah. When you talk about understanding the risk, this is like an interesting topic for me because, I mean, we're a SaaS provider too, right? We offer services. We have to think about security. We get feedback about security requirements from our bug bounty program. Where do you stack it? Where do you stack rank it? Where do you prioritize it? Every time, that's something we're talking about and thinking about internally. And we have to think about what is the risk and what's the calculation of issue stemming from that risk. Is that something that is an active discussion that you have to go through, or do you just say, you know what, you're exposing your RDS, that's not good. I don't know what you're going to store in it. It's not good.
Yeah, I think context comes into play there too. So like, hey, you have a vulnerability on a machine, that's not great, but hey, you have a vulnerability on a machine and it's exposed to the internet, or and it has full IAM admin access and X, Y, and Z. Like, then you do have to consider kind of all the moving parts there. So trying to take that all into consideration and prioritize that and say, okay, we have 15 clients asking for this feature versus, hey, I need to bump this library from 1.0 to 1.1. That sometimes that feature wins, but over time, how do you describe the cumulative risk of all these different factors, whether it's the infrastructure as code misconfiguration vulnerabilities versus software vulnerabilities from a third party that you're introducing, or actual vulnerabilities in the custom code that the company is writing. Trying to take all of that into consideration, I think, is pretty important. I think from a controls development process kind of like lens on that too, from the security perspective, kind of figure out what is the a high impact, maybe low effort thing that we can do to improve the quality of life too. So hey, everybody keeps getting flagged by the security reviews for this specific thing. Can we build a little utility that allows them to get that early feedback loop, like a policy as code tool in their IDE, to say, hey, if I check for this here, I don't have to find it out 2 days before I'm going to prod and then rush to refactor it and make sure it still works with everything.
Yeah, and it's an interesting problem because, I mean, if we focus on infrastructure as code as an example here, right? Sometimes, yes, you make infrastructure immutable. Yes, you manage the lifecycle of the infrastructure in your code, but sometimes there's CRUD operations that you did not factor in can make some big security issues, right? Like something as simple as encrypting data at rest, right? It requires you to destroy the resource, create a new one, and set the right parameters. And most cloud providers, you can't just change that in Terraform sometimes. And we get this a lot, right? It's like, oh, well, why don't you just change a Terraform for us, on our service? And it's like, do you really want to? Do you really want us to cause an outage and lose your data? And it's an interesting topic because, like, you're right. Like, once it's deployed, it's harder to chase. It takes more time. it's always great to do it before. Yeah, it's definitely something to calculate into the risk aspect here, right? Like, well, if you don't fix this now, and we need to fix it later, it's going to take you a year, maybe, right?
Yeah.
I'm just throwing out numbers. Yeah.
And like ultimately with like some of the examples you're giving with encryption and Terraform, like it's one attribute on a resource. So like it's like even if you just literally grepped for the word encrypted, like you could tell if they did it or not. So like it's a cheap thing. It's hard to it's how do you get that consistent across all your development teams pipelines and make sure that everyone is aware of that. But at the same time, I do think the nice thing about the cloud, and even if you look at private cloud and containers in a similar vein, just the ability to have those consistent environments and detect it sooner in development when it is you don't have that prod data loaded into the database yet, and you can just blow it away and stand up a new one. Then that kind of de-risks some of those operations where it's easier to do that. But before you do introduce that complexity and try to figure out how you're going to migrate it without any downtime or whatever.
Yeah, definitely in defense and layers is a recommended approach. So I want to take this in a different direction, and it's sort of a PSA. If that's the best way to describe it. But like, I mean, you've been working on effectively standardizing how cloud is used, cloud service providers are used, right? And as you've been working on this, do you have any advice for organizations on what they should be thinking about now, right? Like, and I say this because, I mean, I'm not going to call it baggage, but you have a lot of understanding of now, with the last 4 years of being in cloud security. It's like, what would you recommend organizations to start really thinking through now? I'll leave it there.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. I think to your point too, like even from 4 years ago, the cloud was in a much better space than 4 years before that. So leveraging just some of the like at scale services that some of the cloud providers provide. So AWS organizations, or managing all your subscriptions or all your projects in GCP kind of thing. So definitely just thinking, whenever you are going to introduce a control, how does it scale for potentially tens or hundreds of accounts, and how would that change over time or anything like that. So sometimes you'll hit limits on the policy size of something or whatnot. The cost of doing something to it. Are you going to be analyzing hundreds of resources, thousands of resources? How much logs is that going to produce? Where are those logs going? I think that's just some of the challenges there. I think to the point too on like putting your toes in different SaaS providers or the infrastructure kind of CSPs, just making sure that you don't kind of boil the ocean. You don't have to understand every service, right? To consume one. So using a kind of allow lists to say, okay, we're going to start using AWS, S3, EC2, RDS, VPCs. A couple services are going to be where we start with, and that's going to be where we want to jump in, or it might be SageMaker or something else if you're interested in data analytics kind of thing. So, what is the value prop that you're trying to kind of deliver there, and then what is the right service there? So, I do think giving some of the cloud services that are not necessarily the straight IaaS ones where you're running a VM and whatnot, giving those a solid shake and say, can I use a higher level service, or do I need to do that trade-off of complexity of running a full VM and worrying about patching and all that versus consuming that higher level service, and kind of using that shared responsibility model to offload that and say, Amazon or Microsoft, you take care of patching the operating system. I don't really need to care about that. So trying to leverage that to not push that complexity on your developers, because I think sometimes developers jumping into cloud in large organizations might be like, hey, I can get around all the requirements of on-prem, but then they just sign up for all the complexity that they just try to avoid, talking to different teams internally. So I think it's just a balance of that, finding those right abstraction points, and not trying to boil the ocean. But I think going back to one of my previous points too, just getting that visibility. So if you can get a CSPM, there's, I think, even an open source CSPM as well too out there. So having some kind of visibility of what's out there. You cannot keep track of everything in 18 different regions and hundreds of accounts just by manually looking through it. So finding automation is kind of the only way to scale. You will never have a big enough security team to try to do all that manually.
The boil of the ocean is a really interesting topic because there's kind of like a trough. I mean, actually, this is a term the guard is, but there's kind of a disillusionment once people start really working in the cloud. Like, wait, I just ran away from the data center with a lot of my old frameworks because I was promised it was going to be easier to deploy, learn new technology, and get it running in days, not weeks, or days, not years, right? It's such a fine balance. It definitely is. It's an interesting topic. I might use your terminology later on internally about allow list. I mean, that is a reality. Is like, do you really need all these services? And it goes back to the nuances like GCP disables all the APIs versus AWS. The moment you open an account, boom, the world's your ocean. And so that's definitely an interesting topic. Yeah.
I was just going to add to that, like even with the static scanning with something like confectionery, being able to just have an allow list of services that are, these have been formally reviewed and we do have policy as code rules for these services, go ahead and use them versus, there's some kind of review process to get it out of there, or we can at least have a conversation to say, yep, we're going to check if it's encrypted and we want this additional logging when you consume the service or whatever.
Yeah. We actually ran into this too ourselves, like when we were going through a SOC 2 audit. It's like, well, what third-party AWS accounts have assume role access into our environments, and what do they have visibility on, and which ones are approved or not approved? Because what if someone just goes into the console and gives third-party access and gives them whatever, right? The keys to the castle. It is a topic, and definitely validating that in the infrastructure is good because it helps to do it before you deploy it, obviously. It's also very, very powerful. I mean, it's really valuable there. Okay.
Just one more thing on that too, sorry. With IAM too, because IAM is just another resource in cloud, like having policies code on IAM is also beautiful because then you can say, does anybody have assume role star? Like on any can they jump else, or you're doing pass role or S3 put object where they could just write to a random S3 bucket, stuff like that. Like that becomes pretty easy to check for statically, which is awesome.
Yeah, I think it gets a little bit gnarly when you think about IAM permission chaining, right? If you think, someone has a role, they can assume another role. That role also gives them grants and other things like creating EC2 instance with any sort of IAM role attached to it. I mean, it's talked about a lot, but the IAM chaining is an interesting problem.
For sure.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm gonna take this in a very different direction now. Highly opinionated. Let's talk about some things like GitOps. Now, everyone has a different definition. What is yours? And then what's your suggestion about, how people need to go about thinking about GitOps? Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's definitely an interesting approach. I think the most popular thing that comes to mind when I've seen it is a lot of Kubernetes configuration. If you've heard of Argo CD, so the GitOps, the Git repo becomes the state, and if anything drifts from that state, it will try to revert it. So I would like these many pods running in this configuration with this load balancer and all these resources configured like that. I think there is some value there. I think where it breaks down over time is if somebody else is consuming your tool as a service. So Git's really good if that interface is somebody coming up, they can do a pull request, they can add some configuration. Hey, I need one more route on an API gateway, or one more service added into the infrastructure at this point. But if you need somebody else within the company, or you have some kind of model, you can't have your customers contribute to your internal Git repos. So how are they going to consume it? You usually will have to switch to an API at some point. So thinking through that, I think I've seen kind of APIs and GitOps as two approaches to handle the intake problem and handling kind of that multi-tenancy. So GitOps gives you a lot of nice, hey, there's already a built-in approval flow. People just make a PR, suggest the changes. You can do the code review. You can build in all that validation and linting and configuration checks. Or do you go the API route and you say, here's our API, here's our contract, here's the parameters you can send. We will still do those validations as well, but it's all the state management of that API is abstracted away, whereas GitOps is more it's fully transparent. Here it is, but you have to go through this process to attempt to modify it anyway.
Yeah, it's an interesting challenge. I want to put it that way, because some organizations are very much staged in what they deploy and when they deploy and how they deploy, right? Like, a lot of organizations legitimately still deploy until only on Fridays, right, or on the weekends, whatever, right? It's legitimate still, and the concept of GitOps is a very interesting challenge. It's like, so does that mean you just wait until you approve or merge the pull requests on Friday at 3 p.m.? It's an interesting thing, right? Because some organizations still work in much more controlled manners, but on the other hand, the benefits of GitOps, like transparency, I mean, self-healing is not quite the right word, but just
drift detection, I guess it could be a good way to put it.
Yeah, drift detection, just state reconciliation. I think that's the best way. Because drift detection is a whole. I mean, reconciling drift is a whole other thing. I mean, geez. But yeah, I mean that's. I think that's a great way to put it. I mean, do you think GitOps is applicable outside of Kubernetes?
I think there's like good lessons from it too. So like having, like I think there's some good stories on open source where like if a PR meets certain requirements and is only updating certain things, like you could do full automation on that as long as all these tests pass. Sure, let's auto merge it. So I think there's some capabilities there and like or some cool stories there where that could happen. I just think it's to the state reconciliation thing. There's the same problems with Terraform too. So I think it's whenever you have that external state store and there's the ability to change it. Is there something that can do a bad like a cron job that says once a second I will check if I drifted at all, and how does it go from out of sync to sync is a hard problem. I do think it's good for like having if you can have everything in that Git repo, and there's lots of companies that'll preach the mono repo and have everything built in there, and you have literally everything. You can have that firewall configuration, you can have everything in there. So I think that's cool to tell that whole story in one spot and not have the complexity of trying to touch 15 different points. But where it breaks down is if you do have to go consume an external service and or somebody has to consume your service, then trying to figure out how you're going to do that. Are you going to have some kind of automation automatically put in git commits to that repo, and then somebody still has to prove it, or it just gets a little funky if you start doing that too, I think.
Yeah, I mean, and it's an interesting concept because it's like, I mean, if we portion it out by departments, right? Like someone might be working on a database, so they have their own repo, their own GitOps model. They deploy and make changes to their databases, and they undergo migrations in their own way. They might even use Ansible or Bash scripts, right, to do migrations too along the way. The other team needs to connect to it, and they now need to manage and be aware of state with that database, and they might be owning just a Lambda function, for example, right? How and then obviously the network effect of across all these other services that are interconnected, it becomes an interesting challenge. I'm curious how people continue to tackle that in the future.
I haven't seen like a good at scale story with it, but I get where people are coming from with it, but like I haven't seen a multi GitOps multi-department story that has resounded with me that like this is a good approach there, kind of thing.
Yeah, it's hard to keep it dry, I mean, frankly, right? Because there's just different variations of the state and different understandings of what state is, and it's just so hard to keep it dry at that point. It's almost like you need kind of a high-level mono repo that represents all these different repos at once. But anyways, okay, so other opinion, value stream management. Now, this word's been thrown out a lot. I want to withhold my opinions, but what's your opinions on this? Like, what's your stance? I mean, is it the new definition of what a DevOps pipeline should represent, or what are your thoughts?
Yeah, as I started kind of getting involved in all this policy as code stuff and trying to figure out in scale how to do it at scale, I definitely kind of got into an interest in like org design and kind of behavioral economics and stuff like that, or organizational psychology, that kind of stuff. But I think at the end of the day, kind of what I was getting at with that productization of you are trying to deliver a specific business capability, can we commoditize that and satisfy it where you're building an API around it? Can we have a nice story of that for an internal customer? Or, if you are a SaaS provider, how do you do multi-tenancy around those different use cases and whatnot? So I think both internally and externally, it's building around that whole concept to deliver end-to-end value where you can have that one click or that one form that you fill out, and that is the only thing you have to deal with. You're not going to talk to 15 different teams to get one thing to production, right? You're just saying, here's all the requirements. I'm providing all the details. Here's my code. Here's my, whatever else you need to provide, and trying to have a good story there. I think if you look at like AWS, they're a really good example of this too, where like the service teams are like micro businesses. They kind of barely even talk to each other because the only way they talk to each other is via the same APIs that you and I consume them with. So if Lambda is going to spin up an EC2 as part of their service, they're using the same API construct that we are. And that if there is a feature request, it probably goes in the same pool that, Cigna as a customer or anybody else as a customer can say, hey, we'd like to see, this extra feature request out of EC2, but, Lambda is just another consumer compared to any other business.
When it comes to security services, because you said SaaSify, right? So I mean, you basically run your own security as a service, right? That's the best way to describe it. Like, how do you quantify to the business? That's an interesting topic here.
Yeah, I think historically looking back at your security department, it might be a policy shop, but the rise of the security engineer, can we actually build capabilities that help improve the risk posture of a development team, so we're value add instead of just saying, we're just a governance function that's trying to prevent you to go from prod. What can we do to improve that story, and reduce the complexity on development teams so that we kind of getting security out of the way, look at security as an enabler instead of a roadblock kind of thing, I think is the major thing there.
Awesome. Yeah, it's almost like it's hard to how to kind of describe, but like you kind of already had a baseline given to you, right? Like for a long time, cloud security saw, here's an issue, here's a risk, you need to mitigate the risk, right? But then that kind of set the tone of like, well, how can we mitigate the risk? How easy is it? How quick can we do it? And how much does this impact our daily workflow, right? And now, in a sense, like those are the metrics to help kind of SaaSify the security service in a sense. It's an interesting way to approach it now, but it all was kind of set as a precedence once governance kind of came in and said, you're not secure, you need to fix it, right? Yeah, it's interesting. Okay. I have one last question. Now, I know this might be a little bit of a kind of a sensitive topic, but managing infrastructure as code, you can't, the reality is you're not doing a mono repo. The reality is you've got hundreds, right? How do you manage all of these stacks, right? And then, what are some advices you would give out there, when you're dealing with infrastructure as code stacks at scale?
Yeah, I think the detective control is your friend there too. So if you do have a setup where your development teams are distributed and kind of enabled to pick their own tooling, and it's not cookie cutter CI/CD pipelines, you're not going to have perfect detection on that static scanning, something like confectionery. But if you can use a CSPM tool or something like that, I think that does help you, regardless if somebody manually logged into the console for whatever reason, or if they used Terraform, they used serverless, the CDK or whatever. There's so many options out there for IAC now, Pulumi, that regardless of how it got there, you're looking at the dynamic state and you're saying, does it have the right tags? Is it encrypted? Does it have logging or anything like that? So I think that's definitely just a table stakes thing. I think kind of a place to watch in the space, I think too, like you can definitely see it with containers, is the concept of like image signing. Could we start signing, state files or stuff like that, where it has, you can attest that's gone through all the required controls, whatever those may be for your company. And can we say it will only deploy if that signature is received? So I think that's a cool space to watch. I know there's like Google and Red Hat are working on that SigStore project. So trying to work on some of that stuff reusable and like reusing image registries as like artifact registries. So that might be just a cool thing to do there. Overall, I think just the flexibility of Terraform is that it will probably have it be here to stay. So just figuring out how you can do those, what is the right level of abstraction for those modules. Sometimes it might be service level, it might be opinionated combinations of services to say, I need a static website or I need a ETL job, and here's how we put those pieces together. I think that continuing to watch that space and how that grows, or like where you want to draw those lines, but constantly trying to move up that bar once it gets too complex will definitely be important too. Yeah, I think overall, not trying to do it on your own, kind of just going back to that community concept too. Like you don't have to have one team that is the Terraform modules team. Let teams contribute and let see what different modules win and make sense for you. But definitely, like there's bound to be two teams that will eventually face the same problem. And if there is an easy internal registry to see what we consume, and there are some public modules as well too. So if you can just get the learnings from even out there in the public, I think that's always helpful too.
Yeah, the image scanning, that was an interesting concept. I'm curious how that might pan out in Terraform. Watch, there'll be a new feature in the next version of this. Okay, awesome. Anthony, we're at the top of the hour. Thank you so much. There was a lot of wisdom you shared. Definitely going to be playing back this recording and kind of listen to it again, because there's so much we were talking about. So I definitely want to review it again. But thank you so much. If you have any questions, let us know. But if it's okay, I'm going to be sharing your repo and your LinkedIn profile as part of our posts. And for anyone listening, feel free to reach out to him on GitHub. Awesome.
Thank you, man. Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank you, Anthony. Talk to you later.